Have you ever wondered how a single moment can completely transform your life? For Paul Rivera, it was an ordinary Saturday in the park. Another day of trying to sell paintings to disinterested tourists. Another day of wondering how he'd make rent. Another day of watching his artistic dreams slowly fade away. Until he spotted a flash of yellow darting across the street. In the 3 seconds it took him to drop his paintbrush and dive into oncoming traffic, Paul had no idea he was about to save the daughter of one of the richest men in the country. He had no idea that the searing pain in his shoulder as he hit the pavement would be the beginning, not the end. And he certainly had no idea that this split-second decision would connect him to a grieving billionaire with a surprising link to Paul's own tragic past. Most importantly, Paul Rivera had no idea that by saving 6-year-old Sophia Blackwood's life, he was unwittingly setting in motion a series of events that would deliver the most perfect form of karma the universe had ever engineered. This is where our story begins. In the heart of the city, where dreams often come to die, Paul Rivera's paintbrush danced across a canvas balanced on a makeshift easel, a stack of milk crates behind a cafe that let him use their alley in exchange for the occasional mural. At 28, Paul's talent was undeniable. His hands created magic that his bank account couldn't cash. The morning light filtered through the narrow urban canyon, illuminating his work in progress, a cityscape where reality and imagination blurred together. Paul stepped back, smudges of blue and orange paint staining his already paint-splattered jeans. "Another masterpiece no one will see," he muttered, checking his watch. "Great, late again." Paul carefully stashed his unfinished canvas behind the dumpster, an arrangement with Miguel, the cafe owner, who kept an eye on his work. He couldn't afford studio space, so alleyways, parks, and his tiny apartment's bathroom had become his rotating galleries. "You're supposed to starve for your art, not because of it," Paul joked to himself, a line he'd repeated so often it had lost its humor months ago. Rushing through the morning crowd, Paul barely made it to his first job of the day, restocking shelves at an art supply store. The irony wasn't lost on him. Surrounded by materials he could barely afford to buy. "You're 10 minutes late, Rivera," his manager called out without looking up from inventory sheets. "Won't happen again, Denise," Paul replied, the same promise he'd made twice last week. "That's what you said yesterday. One more strike and I have to let you go." "We got 20 art students who'd kill for this job." Paul nodded, slipping on his name tag. The store paid minimum wage but offered a small employee discount that made his art supplies almost affordable. He couldn't lose this job. Not now. Not when rent was due in 5 days and his bank account held less than double digits. 8 hours later, after his shift ended, Paul headed to his second job, waiting tables at a tourist trap restaurant downtown. By the time he clocked out at 11 p.m., his feet ached, and his creative spirit was buried under the weight of exhaustion. But still he painted. In his tiny apartment, under the harsh light of a dollar store lamp, Paul worked on commission pieces that paid a fraction of what they were worth. 3 hours of sleep later, he'd wake and repeat the cycle. This was Paul's life. Art was his passion, his purpose, but lately he wondered if passion alone could sustain him. Saturday was Paul's only day off from both jobs. He spent it in Westlake Park, setting up his easel and painting the passing crowds. Sometimes a tourist would stop, watch him work, even buy a small piece. These rare sales kept his dream on life support. "Your technique is incredible," an older woman commented, watching him capture the reflection of clouds in a nearby fountain. "Have you tried reaching out to galleries?" Paul smiled politely. "About 37 of them, actually. Still waiting for number 38 to return my call." "Their loss," she said, dropping $5 in his tip jar before moving on. $5. Not even enough for a decent set of brushes. But he took a deep breath and continued painting, reminding himself that Van Gogh sold only one painting in his lifetime. Though Paul hoped his own recognition might come before he was dead. The afternoon sun had reached its peak when something caught Paul's attention, a flash of bright yellow darting between distracted adults. A little girl, no more than 6 years old, chasing a butterfly. Her expensive clothes and the careful way her hair was styled suggested money, but there was no adult watching her. Paul scanned the area and spotted a woman in her early 30s, seated on a bench about 30 yards away, completely absorbed in her phone. The woman occasionally glanced up, but her attention immediately returned to her screen, fingers typing rapidly. The little girl continued chasing the butterfly, getting dangerously close to the street. Paul kept painting, but his eyes tracked her movement, increasingly concerned as she approached the curb. "Hey," he called out, but his voice was lost in the urban noise. Then everything happened in an instant. The butterfly fluttered across the street. The little girl, without hesitation, stepped off the curb after it. A taxi, speeding to make a yellow light, bore down on her, the driver distracted by his GPS. Paul didn't think. He dropped his paintbrush, canvas crashing to the ground as he lunged forward. 3 long strides, and he reached the edge of the sidewalk, diving into the street. His arms wrapped around the small child, momentum carrying them both across the opposite lane. The taxi's horn blared as it swerved, missing them by inches. Paul twisted his body to absorb the impact with the pavement, the child cradled against his chest. They rolled onto the opposite sidewalk, safe from traffic but not from injury. Pain shot through Paul's shoulder and down his right arm, his painting arm. The little girl looked up at him, eyes wide with shock but unharmed. "Are you an angel?" she asked, her voice small but steady. "Despite the pain," Paul laughed. "No, definitely not. Just someone who saw you needed help." "Sophia?" The woman from the bench finally noticed the commotion, rushing across the street when traffic cleared. "Oh my God, Sophia!" The girl, Sophia, stood up, brushing gravel from her yellow dress. "I'm okay. He saved me." She pointed at Paul, who was struggling to sit up, his face contorted in pain. "What were you thinking, running into the street like that?" The woman scolded Sophia before turning to Paul. "Thank you, but I had everything under control." Under control? Paul couldn't help himself. "She was about to become street pizza while you're glued to Instagram, or whatever." The woman flushed, clutching Sophia's hand tightly. "I'm her nanny." "I just looked away for a second." "These things happen. These things shouldn't happen," Paul countered, trying to move his arm and wincing. "She could have been killed." A small crowd had gathered. Someone had called an ambulance, and within minutes, paramedics were examining Paul's shoulder. "Likely dislocated," one of them said. "We should take you to the hospital to make sure there's no fracture." Paul immediately thought about the cost. "I don't have insurance." "I'll be fine." "You need medical attention," the paramedic insisted. "I need to not be in debt for the next decade." Paul shot back, attempting to stand. The nanny, still holding Sophia's hand, stepped forward. "Mr. Blackwood will cover any medical expenses." "It's the least we can do." Paul froze. "Mr. Blackwood? As in Thomas Blackwood? The tech guy?" The woman, Vivian, according to her reluctantly offered introduction, nodded stiffly. "Yes. Sophia is his daughter." That explained the designer clothes on a 6-year-old. Thomas Blackwood was more than just the tech guy. He was a billionaire whose software company had revolutionized artificial intelligence. He was also notoriously private, rarely appearing in public after his wife's death a few years ago. "Just get checked out," Vivian insisted, her tone softening slightly. "I'll inform Mr. Blackwood immediately." Paul looked down at Sophia, who stared back with curious eyes. "You dropped your pictures," she said, pointing across the street where his painting lay forgotten, likely trampled by now. "It's okay. I can make more," Paul reassured her, though inside he calculated the lost income from his ruined work. The ambulance ride was awkward. Paul sat with an ice pack on his shoulder, while Vivian made tense phone calls and Sophia peppered him with questions. "Do you make pictures all day? What's your favorite color? Does your arm hurt a lot? Can you teach me to paint butterflies?" Despite his pain and anxiety about medical bills, Paul found himself smiling at her curiosity. He answered each question patiently, surprised by how articulate she was for such a young child. At the hospital, Paul was whisked away for x-rays while Vivian and Sophia waited in a private room, special treatment for the Blackwood name, no doubt. The doctor confirmed his shoulder was dislocated but not fractured. They sedated him briefly to pop it back into place, and when he awoke, his arm was in a sling. "You'll need to rest it for at least 2 weeks, the doctor explained. "No heavy lifting, no painting." 2 weeks without painting meant 2 weeks without potential income from his park sales or commissions. Paul's stomach tightened at the thought. As he was processing this news, the hospital room door opened. A tall, imposing figure entered, Thomas Blackwood himself. In person, he looked older than his 43 years, with premature gray at his temples and lines etched deeply around his eyes. His custom suit probably cost more than Paul's annual income. "Mr. Rivera?" Blackwood's voice was deep and measured. "I understand. I owe you a debt of gratitude." "Anyone would have done the same," Paul replied automatically. No, Blackwood said firmly. They wouldn't have. I've reviewed the security footage from the park. You risked your life without hesitation. For a stranger, Paul shifted uncomfortably under his intense gaze. How's Sophia? Physically fine. Emotionally, she's quite taken with her hero. Blackwood's mouth twitched, almost a smile, but not quite. She hasn't stopped talking about you and your paintings. An awkward silence fell. Blackwood cleared his throat. I understand you're an artist. Trying to be, Paul admitted. Blackwood nodded, then reached inside his jacket and pulled out a checkbook. I'd like to compensate you both for your medical expenses and for your act of bravery. Paul watched as the billionaire wrote a check with more zeros than he'd ever seen in his bank account. When Blackwood held it out, Paul didn't move to take it. I don't want your money, Mr. Blackwood. The billionaire's eyebrows rose slightly, genuine surprise crossing his features. Everyone wants money, Mr. Rivera, especially struggling artists. What I want, Paul said carefully, is for Sophia to have someone watching her who isn't more interested in their phone than her safety. Blackwood's expression hardened momentarily, then softened into something unexpected, respect. That's a fair request, he acknowledged, tucking the check away. Is there anything else? Paul thought for a moment. Actually, yes. Tell Sophia I hope she catches that butterfly next time. Just not in the middle of the street. For the first time, Thomas Blackwood smiled, a small rusty thing, as if the muscles weren't used to the movement. I'll relay the message, he said, turning to leave. At the door, he paused. Mr. Rivera, thank you. Truly. As the door closed behind the billionaire, Paul leaned back against the hospital pillows, wondering what strange twist of fate had put him in the path of the Blackwoods, and whether their lives would ever intersect again. What he couldn't know was that this chance encounter would change everything, for all of them. 3 days after the accident, Paul sat in his apartment staring at the ceiling. His arm throbbed in the sling, and bills covered his small kitchen table like fallen autumn leaves. The rent notice, now with a red final warning stamp, sat on top of the pile. His manager at the art supply store had been understanding about his injury, holding his position for 2 weeks. The restaurant, however, had already replaced him. Paul's phone rang, an unknown number lighting up the screen. Hello, he answered cautiously. Mr. Rivera? This is Vivian Taylor, Sophia Blackwood's nanny. Paul sat up straighter. Is Sophia okay? She's fine, Vivian replied, her tone professional but with an undercurrent of irritation. Actually, she's been asking about you constantly. Mr. Blackwood would like to invite you to dinner at their home tomorrow evening, as a proper thank you for your heroism. Paul hesitated. Something in Vivian's voice suggested this wasn't her idea. This is Mr. Blackwood's request, he asked. A slight pause. Yes. He and Sophia both insist. A car will collect you at 6 p.m., if you agree. Paul looked around his shabby apartment, at his unmade futon and the stacks of canvases leaning against every wall. What would he even wear to a billionaire's house? I appreciate the invitation, but Sophia would be very disappointed, Vivian interrupted. She's been quite difficult since the incident. She's convinced herself you're some sort of magical artist who saved her life. Something in her tone raised Paul's hackles. Was she implying he wasn't good enough to associate with the Blackwoods? Or was she jealous of a child's fascination? Well, we can't disappoint Sophia, can we? He replied, making a snap decision. I'll be ready at 6. After providing his address, Paul hung up and immediately panicked. His nicest clothes were paint-stained jeans and a button-up shirt he'd worn to his grandmother's funeral 4 years ago. Making rent was one thing. Looking presentable for dinner with a billionaire was another matter entirely. The next day, after a trip to a thrift store that depleted his emergency fund, Paul stood outside his building in pressed slacks and a decent navy blazer. Right at 6 p.m., a sleek black car pulled up and a uniformed driver stepped out. Mr. Rivera, I'm here to take you to the Blackwood residence. The drive took them out of the city, through winding hills to an area Paul had only seen in magazines. Massive estates hidden behind security gates and dense foliage. The car turned onto a private road and approached a modern glass and stone structure that seemed to grow organically from the hillside. We've arrived, sir, the driver announced, pulling up to an entrance flanked by subtle security cameras. Paul stepped out, his borrowed dress shoes squeaking slightly. Before he could reach the door, it swung open, and Sophia burst out, a yellow blur racing toward him. You came. You really came, she exclaimed, stopping just short of crashing into him. Her eyes widened at his sling. Does your arm still hurt because you saved me? Paul smiled, genuinely touched by her concern. It's getting better every day. I hear you've been asking about me. Every single minute, confirmed a deep voice from the doorway. Thomas Blackwood stood there, more casually dressed than a hospital, though his idea of casual still looked expensive. She's been quite persistent. Please come in. The interior of the Blackwood home was a study in minimalism, clean lines, neutral colors, and strategic lighting that highlighted an impressive art collection. Paul tried not to gawk as they passed what he was certain was an original Rothko. Your home is beautiful, Paul said politely, feeling increasingly out of place. It's just a house, Thomas replied with a shrug. My late wife, Elena, designed it. She had an eye for these things. Sophia tugged at Paul's good arm. Do you want to see my paintings? I've been practicing. Sophia, Thomas gently admonished. Let our guests settle in first. Vivian appeared from a side hallway, her smile tight. Dinner will be served in 10 minutes. Sophia, you need to wash your hands. But I want to show Paul my art studio. After dinner, Thomas promised, giving his daughter a look that brooked no argument. Reluctantly, Sophia followed Vivian down the hall, throwing glances back at Paul as if afraid he might disappear. She's quite taken with you, Thomas observed, leading Paul into a spacious living area with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city lights below. Can I offer you a drink? Just water, thanks, Paul replied, aware that any alcohol would likely be wasted on his unrefined palate. Thomas poured himself a whiskey and handed Paul a glass of water. An awkward silence fell between them, the billionaire and the starving artist, from worlds so different they might as well be different planets. I've looked into your work, Thomas said finally, catching Paul off guard. My work? Thomas nodded. I make it a point to know who I'm dealing with. You have talent, though the market clearly hasn't recognized it yet. Paul wasn't sure whether to be flattered or unnerved. The art world is complicated. All worlds are complicated, Mr. Rivera. Business, technology, art, they all operate on relationships and timing as much as merit. Thomas took a sip of his whiskey. My wife was an art lover. Those pieces you were admiring? Her selections, not mine. I never quite understood her passion for it. Before Paul could respond, Vivian announced dinner was ready. The dining room featured a table that could easily seat 20, though only 3 places were set at one end. Sophia insisted on sitting next to Paul, leaving Thomas at the head of the table and creating a conspicuous empty space where Vivian would normally sit. Throughout dinner, a meal finer than any Paul had eaten in years, Sophia dominated the conversation, peppering Paul with questions about his art. What's your favorite thing to paint? How do you make colors look like they're glowing? Did you go to art school? Paul answered each question thoughtfully, aware of Thomas watching their interaction with an inscrutable expression. I want to be an artist too, Sophia declared between bites of roasted vegetables. But Daddy says I should focus on math and science because that's where the future is. The future needs art too, Paul replied automatically, then glanced at Thomas. Though math and science are certainly important. Thomas studied Paul over his wine glass. My daughter receives excellent education in all subjects, but practical skills will serve her better in life than paintbrushes. With respect, Mr. Blackwood, art is practical, Paul said before he could stop himself. It teaches observation, patience, creative problem-solving, skills useful in any field, including technology. Rather than being offended, Thomas looked intrigued. An interesting perspective. My wife would have agreed with you. Mommy painted with me all the time, Sophia said quietly. But she went to heaven, and now nobody paints with me. The simple statement landed like a stone in still water, ripples of emotion crossing Thomas's face before he composed himself. Paul recognized grief when he saw it, the same expression he'd worn after losing his own parents years ago. I have tutors for art, Sophia continued, oblivious to the tension. But they just tell me what to do. They don't show me the magic like you do in the park. Magic? Paul questioned. The way you see things nobody else does. The way you make ordinary things look special. Out of the mouths of babes. Paul felt a lump in his throat at her innocent yet profound understanding of what drove him to create art despite all obstacles. Paul should teach me, Sophia suddenly exclaimed, turning to her father with bright eyes. He could be my art teacher. Thomas opened his mouth, likely to dismiss the idea, when Sophia continued earnestly. Please, Daddy. I haven't wanted to paint since Mommy, but I want to learn from Paul. Please. The naked vulnerability in her plea seemed to catch Thomas off guard. He looked from his daughter to Paul, conflicting emotions warring behind his eyes. Mr. Rivera is a professional artist, Sophia. He has his own work to consider. Actually, Paul interjected, seizing an unexpected opportunity. I would be happy to teach Sophia. My shoulder needs a few weeks to heal anyway, so I can't do my usual commission work. Thomas raised an eyebrow. You're offering art lessons. If you're interested, Paul said carefully. Once a week, perhaps? Just until my shoulder heals completely. What he didn't say was how desperately he needed the income such lessons would provide, especially now that he'd lost one of his jobs. Thomas studied him for a long moment. Sophia, why don't you go ask Vivian about dessert while I discuss this with Mr. Rivera? Once Sophia had skipped from the room, Thomas leaned forward. Let's be frank. You need money, and I need someone to make my daughter happy. I'll pay you generously for weekly lessons, but there are conditions. I'm listening, Paul said, trying to keep his expression neutral despite his racing heart. First, these are temporary arrangements. 6 weeks maximum, until your injury heals. Second, all lessons take place here supervised. Third, this arrangement stays private. No social media, no press. Paul nodded slowly. Those terms are acceptable. But I have one condition of my own. Thomas looked surprised, then amused. You're negotiating with me? For Sophia's benefit, yes. Don't treat art as less valuable than her other subjects. If she shows genuine interest and talent, it deserves the same respect as math or science. Thomas's expression softened almost imperceptibly. You remind me of Elena. She was equally passionate about defending the arts in education. He extended his hand. We have an agreement, Mr. Rivera. Paul shook it, ignoring the twinge in his injured shoulder. Please call me Paul. Paul it is. You'll start next Wednesday. My assistant will contact you with details. When Sophia returned with Vivian trailing behind her, Thomas informed her that Paul would indeed become her art teacher. Her reaction, jumping up and down with unbridled joy, brought a genuine smile to her father's face, a rare sight according to the surprised look on Vivian's face. The nanny's expression, however, quickly shifted to something colder as she looked at Paul. Though she said nothing, her message was clear. She didn't approve of this arrangement. As dinner concluded and Paul prepared to leave, Sophia insisted on showing him her art studio, a sunlit room filled with more professional supplies than most working artists could afford. Canvases lined the walls, many half-finished, all showing promise beyond her years. Mommy and I used to paint here every Sunday, she explained, running her small hand along an easel. But after she went to heaven, I didn't want to anymore. It made me too sad. Paul knelt beside her, meeting her at eye level. It's okay to feel sad sometimes, Sophia. Art can help with that, too. Sometimes the most beautiful things come from our deepest feelings. She nodded solemnly. Will you help me make beautiful things from my sad feelings? I'll do my best, he promised. As the driver took Paul back to his apartment, he reflected on the strange turn his life had taken. One moment of instinct, running into traffic to save a child, had connected him to people from another world entirely. He couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had begun, something that would change all their lives in ways none of them could yet imagine. The following Wednesday, Paul arrived for Sophia's first lesson to find her practically vibrating with excitement. Thomas made a brief appearance, observing from the doorway as Paul guided Sophia through mixing colors and creating simple brushstrokes. You make it look so easy, Thomas commented as Sophia concentrated on her canvas. The basics are easy, Paul replied. It's the lifetime of practice afterward that's challenging. Thomas watched his daughter for a moment longer. She hasn't been this focused since before Elena died. You have a gift for teaching, it seems. Sophia has a gift for learning, Paul countered. I'm just giving her tools to express what's already inside her. When Thomas left for a business meeting, Vivian took his place, watching from a chair in the corner, her attention divided between Sophia and her ever-present phone. Her presence created a subtle tension that Paul tried to ignore for Sophia's sake. As weeks passed, Paul's shoulder healed, and Sophia's skills developed remarkably. Their Wednesday sessions expanded to include different techniques, watercolors, charcoal, even simple sculpture. Each week, Thomas would observe for a few minutes, then disappear into his work, but always returned at the end to see what his daughter had created. Gradually, something unexpected happened. The cold, imposing mansion began to feel warmer. Laughter, Sophia's bright peals, and sometimes even Paul's deeper chuckle echoed through previously silent hallways. Color crept back into a home that had been functioning in grayscale since Elena's death. By the fifth week, Thomas was staying longer during the lessons, occasionally asking questions about techniques or art history. Once, Paul caught him smiling at a splash of paint on his expensive shirt sleeve, a casualty of an enthusiastic demonstration of splattering techniques that had delighted Sophia. "You know," Thomas remarked during Paul's sixth and supposedly final lesson, "I think we might extend these sessions." Sophia's grades in her other subjects have improved since she started painting again. Her therapist says she's opening up more too. Paul, who had been dreading the end of his employment, felt a weight lift from his shoulders. "I'd be happy to continue." "Excellent. Oh, and I'm hosting a small gathering this weekend, some business associates and their families. Nothing formal." Sophia has requested that her art teacher attend. The invitation caught Paul by surprise. "Are you sure that's appropriate?" Thomas raised an eyebrow. "It's my house, Paul. I decide what's appropriate. Besides, Sophia wants to show off her progress to our guests." What Thomas didn't say, but Paul understood, was that this represented a significant shift in their relationship. No longer merely an employee, Paul was being invited into their social circle, however tentatively. As Paul packed up his teaching supplies that day, Vivian appeared in the doorway after Sophia had run off to her next lesson. "You've certainly made yourself indispensable," she remarked, her tone deceptively light. "Quite the rags to riches story in the making." Paul looked up sharply. "Excuse me?" "Oh, nothing," Vivian smiled thinly. "It's just interesting how quickly you've ingratiated yourself with the Blackwoods. One might almost think you planned it." "I risked my life to save Sophia," Paul replied evenly. "Because it was the right thing to do, not as some elaborate scheme to meet her father." Vivian shrugged. "Of course. I'm simply observing how convenient it's all been for you." The struggling artist suddenly with access to one of the wealthiest men in the country. Before Paul could respond, she turned and walked away, leaving him with an uneasy feeling. Her implication was clear. She saw him as an opportunist, using Sophia's affection to improve his circumstances. The accusation stung, because there was a grain of truth in it. While he genuinely cared about Sophia's development as an artist, the weekly payments from Thomas had saved him from eviction and allowed him to focus more on his own art between teaching sessions. As Paul left the Blackwood estate that day, he couldn't help wondering if he had crossed some invisible line from honored guest back to interloper, and whether Vivian's apparent dislike might eventually poison what had become the most unexpected and rewarding relationship of his life. What he didn't realize was that Vivian's resentment ran deeper than professional jealousy, and that her plans to remove him from the Blackwoods' lives were already taking shape. The weekend gathering at the Blackwood estate marked a turning point. As Paul mingled awkwardly among tech executives and venture capitalists, he couldn't help feeling like an exotic specimen on display. Yet Sophia proudly introduced him to everyone as "my artist," with such proprietary affection that even the most judgmental guests softened. Thomas had surprised Paul by displaying several of Sophia's paintings throughout the main hall, alongside a small selection of Paul's own work, pieces he'd brought for teaching demonstrations. The validation was intoxicating, especially when a gallery owner discreetly handed Paul her business card. "Your work has something fresh," she whispered. "Call me when you're ready for a proper showing." Vivian observed this exchange from across the room, her eyes narrowing. For weeks, she'd watched her influence over the Blackwoods diminish as Paul's grew. After 3 years as Sophia's nanny, and secretly hoping to eventually catch Thomas's interest, this struggling artist had disrupted everything in mere months. The following Wednesday, Paul arrived for Sophia's lesson to find the house unusually tense. Thomas was locked in his home office on an emergency call, while Sophia waited in the art studio, uncharacteristically subdued. "What's wrong?" Paul asked, setting down his supplies. Sophia glanced toward the doorway before whispering, "Vivian said you're only being nice to me and Daddy because we have money." The innocent report of adult manipulation hit Paul like a physical blow. "That's absolutely not true, Sophia." "I told her that." Sophia nodded firmly. "I said you saved me before you even knew who my daddy was." Paul squeezed her shoulder gently. "Exactly. And I teach you because you have incredible talent and because I enjoy our time together. It has nothing to do with money." The lesson proceeded normally, though Paul noticed Vivian hovering more than usual, her attention rarely on her phone. When Thomas finally emerged from his office looking exhausted, Vivian immediately approached him with coffee and sympathy, pointedly excluding Paul from their conversation. 2 days later, Paul received an urgent text from Thomas. "Need to see you immediately. Car coming in 30 minutes. When Paul arrived at the Blackwood estate, Thomas was waiting in his office, his expression thunderous. On his desk lay a small abstract painting Paul recognized as one of his demonstration pieces. "Explain this," Thomas demanded, his voice dangerously controlled. "It's a piece I created while showing Sophia how to layer acrylics," Paul replied, confused. "What about it?" Thomas reached into a drawer and produced a photograph of an almost identical painting, but significantly larger and clearly hung in a gallery setting. "And this?" Thomas asked. Paul studied the photo, bewildered. "I don't understand. That looks like my work, but I've never created anything that size, and it's certainly never been exhibited." "This," Thomas said, tapping the photo, "is Urban Metamorphosis by Argentinian artist Javier Morales, currently valued at approximately $200,000. It was hanging in my private collection until yesterday, when it mysteriously disappeared, replaced by your demonstration piece." The implication hit Paul like a freight train. "You think I stole it? That's insane. Why would I replace a valuable painting with my own work? Perhaps to throw off suspicion? Or simply arrogance?" Thomas's voice was ice. "The timing is conspicuous. Right after you gained access to the house, including areas beyond the art studio. I would never steal from you, or anyone." Paul protested. "This has to be a misunderstanding. The security system logged no unauthorized entries. Only household members and approved guests, including you." Thomas stood. "I've already contacted the authorities. They'll want to search your apartment. Search it then. You won't find anything." Paul felt sick. "Thomas, think about this. Why would I risk everything for one painting? My career is finally gaining momentum because of my connection to you and Sophia." "Perhaps that was insufficient," Thomas replied coldly. "I trusted you, Paul. Welcomed you into my home. My daughter adores you. And this is how you repay that trust." "Daddy." Sophia's small voice came from the doorway. She stood clutching her tablet, eyes wide with confusion. "Why are you yelling at Paul? Go to your room, Sophia," Thomas ordered. "This doesn't concern you." "But it does," she insisted, approaching cautiously. "Vivian told me Paul might not come back, and I wanted to show him my new drawing, so I recorded our lesson yesterday to show you how good I'm getting and—" "What recording?" Paul interrupted, a sudden suspicion forming. Sophia held out her tablet. "I was practicing time-lapse videos." "See?" She pressed play, and the screen showed a sped-up recording of yesterday's art lesson. But the video hadn't started recording when she thought. It had been running earlier, capturing the empty studio before their lesson began. And there, clear as day, was Vivian entering with a large canvas under a cloth, carefully removing the Morales painting from the wall and replacing it with Paul's demonstration piece. Thomas froze, watching the evidence unfold. "Sophia, when did you start recording?" "I set it up before breakfast," she explained. "I wanted to catch the morning light in the studio." Paul felt lightheaded with relief. "Thomas, I—" "Don't." Thomas raised a hand, his face ashen. "I owe you an apology. Clearly, I've been misled." He reached for the house intercom. "Security, please locate Miss Taylor and escort her to my office immediately." What followed was chaos. When security approached Vivian, she panicked, locking herself in a guest room with the stolen painting. In her desperate attempt to destroy the evidence, she accidentally knocked over a candle, setting fire to the antique curtains. By the time security breached the door, the smoke had triggered the sprinkler system. The painting was saved, but the water damaged a section of the wall, revealing a hidden safe behind a built-in bookcase. "I didn't know that was there," Thomas said as workers repaired the water damage later that day. Curious, he had his security team open it, expecting to find more of Elena's valuables. Instead, they discovered a folder of documents, old business records Thomas had assumed were lost years ago. As he reviewed them that evening after Sophia was asleep, Thomas discovered something shocking. One of his earliest hostile takeovers had been of a small design firm called Rivera Innovations. "It can't be," he whispered, checking the owner's name. "Gabriel Rivera, Paul's father." Thomas remembered the acquisition vaguely, one of many he'd executed during his aggressive expansion phase. The documents revealed tactics that, while legal, pushed ethical boundaries, artificially driving down the company's value, planting negative press, even personal smear campaigns against the owner. Gabriel Rivera had lost everything in a takeover, suffering a heart attack shortly after. His son had been forced to abandon his art school scholarship to support the family. That son was Paul. The universe had orchestrated a perfect circle of karma. The boy whose future Thomas had inadvertently destroyed had grown up to save Thomas's greatest treasure, his daughter. When Paul arrived for Sophia's lesson the following week, after Vivian had been dismissed and charged with theft, Thomas was waiting with a folder. "I think you should see this," he said, handing Paul the documents. Paul scanned them, his expression shifting from confusion to shock to quiet understanding. "You didn't know?" Paul said finally, a statement rather than a question. "Not specifically, no. It was one acquisition among dozens." Thomas met his gaze directly. "But my ignorance doesn't diminish my responsibility. Your father's company was collateral damage in my ambition." Paul closed the folder. "I was 19 when this happened. Had to drop out of art school when Dad got sick after losing everything. I never connected your name to that company. And now you know," Thomas said quietly. "The question is, what happens next?" Paul considered this for a long moment. "My father always said business was just business. He didn't believe in holding grudges." He smiled sadly. "Though he probably wouldn't have approved of me working for the man who took his company. Would it help if that man offered to make amends?" Thomas asked. 1 month later, Paul stood nervously in a prestigious downtown gallery, surrounded by his work. Thomas had not only secured him the exhibition, but had purchased his first 10 paintings at well above asking price. An investment, not charity, he'd insisted. Art critics, collectors, and media filled the space. In the center of it all stood Sophia, proudly giving impromptu tours of her teacher's masterpieces. Thomas approached Paul with 2 glasses of champagne. To karma, he toasted quietly. To second chances, Paul countered, clinking glasses. In the year that followed, Paul's career flourished. He continued teaching Sophia, whose talent blossomed remarkably. Thomas, inspired by his daughter and increasingly by Paul's perspective, transformed his business practices, establishing an arts endowment and a fund for entrepreneurs displaced by corporate takeovers. The Blackwood mansion, once cold and gallery-like, gradually became a home again, walls adorned with both purchased masterpieces and the evolving work of its residents. Even Thomas occasionally joined their art lessons, discovering a surprising talent for sculpture. None of them forgot the strange sequence of events that brought them together: a butterfly, a moment of heroism, a jealous nanny, and documents hidden years ago, all conspiring to bring 3 broken lives together to heal each other. The universe, it seemed, had a paintbrush of its own, creating beauty from the most unlikely circumstances.